Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their timeless and extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. There are more than 175 interviews in this podcast series. Listen to them wherever you get your podcasts or at aarecoveryinterviews.com. Growing up in a home fractured by alcoholism, today's guest, Bret B, had first-hand exposure to his father's untreated disease. The physical and verbal abuse was a lot for a child to handle. Unfortunately, any solace or comfort that might have been offered by Bret's mother was extinguished by a stroke she suffered in her early 30s when Bret was 8, which left her paralyzed and unable to speak. Like many alcoholics who survived traumatic childhoods, Bret found booze in his teens. It helped him through any troubles he faced in high school and college. As a functional alcohol abuser, he somehow managed to earn a master's degree and a high-paying job right out of college. But the luster of his early achievements wore off quickly as drinking became an enslaving part of his life. Many lost jobs and divorces provided overwhelming evidence that his life was self-destructing at a rapid pace. By the time he finally made it into AA at age 35, Bret had created a mountain of wreckage which appeared insurmountable. Fortunately, he found a strong AA community that was committed to helping the newcomer. With the help of a great fellowship and a wise sponsor, Bret immersed himself in the program. Going to meetings, working the 12 steps, and sponsoring other men became a vital part of his life. Today, as a dedicated and active member of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bret has made the program central to his life. The gifts of sobriety continue to materialize in both his personal and professional lives. I feel that Bret's story, brightened by continuous involvement in AA, is one every alcoholic should hear. So put your phone on Do Not Disturb and enjoy the rousing words of this episode of AA Recovery Interviews with my friend and AA brother, Bret B.
My name is Bret. I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Bret. That's the typical response. And isn't it great to have a room full of people who acknowledge you when you go in and everybody says hi? I mean, I don't know any other places that have that kind of warmth and welcoming atmosphere.
I agree.
I really appreciate you taking the time to do this interview today. Actually, you were referred to me by our good friend Jeff S., who suggested, he said, you got to hear Bret's story. And sometimes a referral from a trusted friend will lead to that happening, and this worked out great.
Well, there's no coincidences in the world, in this program of Alcoholics Anonymous in particular. And so I met Jeff. He sent me his copy of his podcast with you maybe a week later. I happened to be driving to the coast, and so I listened to it the whole way. And then, miraculously, he sent me a text at the end of that randomly, just asking how it's going, what's going on, if I would be willing to do this. I just listened to the whole podcast. So, yeah, I was like, of course, great. Let's go.
I like to hear that people are actually listening to it. That's good to know. So, you're there in Austin?
I am.
Then what is your sobriety date?
So my sobriety date is August 29th, 2011.
You're coming up on...
14 years.
15 years ago at this point, what were you thinking about ever being in Alcoholics Anonymous?
I'd been exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous, but I was still in the throes of addiction. So, I got sober when I was 35. And so leading up to that point was, my adult life has basically been an addict. More than my adult life, but, let's go back to, call it 16, 17, but really bad kind of in my early 20s. And then from my early 20s to 35 when I was finally ready to sit all the way down. But that was not my first exposure to AA, to be clear. I'd probably been exposed to it, meaning I'd walked into a meeting maybe 8 years before. And so it took some time for me to sit all the way down.
What did you think about that meeting that you walked into?
I'll never forget that meeting. The first meeting I walked into, it was in La Jolla, California, and I needed to make an amends with somebody in a relationship that had gotten sideways, and I walked into this meeting. It was on this cliff in La Jolla, California. It was outside. It was lovely. It was overlooking the ocean in this church atrium. There were about 8 people in there, and I walked in and I identified that it was my first meeting. And I almost immediately went to tears. And of course, everyone was very gracious and lovely. And the guy who chaired the meeting, he started the meeting. And I since found out he was an executive, I believe at GM. But he had this really cool kind of stance about him. He was a big guy, older guy. He had a cane, had these wraparound kind of Ray-Bans on because the meeting was kind of an indoor-outdoor meeting. And he started the meeting and he said, I used to be master of the universe and a goddamn genius. And then I got sober. And then he went into this whole thing that was so great. So it was so relatable to me. I remember the topic was about step 3. And another guy in the meeting shared, and he said he had, I believe it was 23 years of sobriety. And he said he introduced himself as an alcoholic, of course. And then he said, I've been an atheist for the last several decades, and I'm still an atheist. And there's this beautiful tree that was growing out of the atrium. And he said, but here's the thing I've understood in this program, which is that tree was not made by man. And that's all I need to know in order to be successful in this program, that there's something else out there. And that just kind of, immediately crumbled the ideas that I had, the preconceived notions about what a higher power needed to look like. And anyway, it's just, as often happens in this program, it's the right thing is said at the right time.
Yeah, and some people get really conflicted about when they see God early on in the steps and early on in their own programs. What were the circumstances that led you to that meeting?
At that point I was drinking a ton, 2 bottles of, wine a night, and was completely hungover. And, my best friend had gotten into this program ahead of me. I've thought about it. If he didn't get sober, I know it would have taken me a lot longer, but even my hard head could see what it had done for him. And he had really turned his life around, going from being incarcerated to, graduating top of this class of Georgetown Law School and going to Wall Street and getting a job at, a great law firm, and then going to Goldman Sachs, and all this while he was sober, of course. And so I'm watching all of that happen while I'm still in the throes of addiction, and knowing that he had done this through the program was kind of the thing that I knew it would work when I was ready to start listening. It took another 8 years till I went to the meeting that actually changed my life, I would say. The meeting that I actually left and never drank from again and used from.
How old were you when you went to that first meeting?
Let's see, I would have been, whatever that was, 28 or so.
Can I assume that you started to drink in your teens, high school? Tell me about that.
I grew up in an alcoholic family. So my dad drank himself to death in 2017.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
That's all right. So my dad drank himself to death. My brother is still hardcore junkie and out there. I have a sister who it did not touch. My mom, I don't think is an alcoholic, but used alcohol and drugs for sure. And so it had been in my life from day one. And in retrospect, I don't ever remember spending 24 hours with my dad that he was not using. And so there was only one time we did a 24-hour drive from Texas to Cape Cod, and I was with him the whole time, and he didn't drink. I don't know that he didn't use, but I didn't see him drink. That's the only time I could say for certain that he wasn't using, or wasn't drinking at least. And so I grew up in an alcoholic family, and I think like most people that grow up in alcoholic families, the early days started off okay from the outside, from the curb appeal. Of most people, it seemed okay. My dad went to an Ivy League school and was a lawyer, went to law school and had all the things on the walls that would represent you're an intelligent, successful human being. Mm-hmm. But on the inside, things were quite broken. My mom had a stroke when she was 33. I was in the 2nd grade. And she used cocaine the day that she had a stroke. And so there were things that led up to that, but that was a big pivotal point in my childhood. I was in the 2nd grade. She suffered from a stroke. She's still paralyzed from that, so she's paralyzed on the right side of her body. That put a lot of strain on my family, and my dad's drinking started to really escalate. And then over the years, it got worse and worse. I was in high school, and I started to find drinking and the outlet of that. And, it just got to the point. I remember grew up in Austin, Texas, and then I went to college and undergrad here at UT. And my drinking and drug use got really escalated at the University of Texas. And by the time I moved to California for my first job, I had a job in some finance company, and I was working out there, and we went to lunch one day with the partners of that firm, and they didn't drink at lunch. And I thought that was so weird, because I'd lived in a world where all the adults drank at lunch. And so I remember kind of in retrospect looking back at that and recognizing how absurd that is, that I would think that all adults that go to lunch during the workday drink, because that's just what I'd been exposed to in my life.
Well, the 3-martini lunch is pretty much an arcane idea these days, and most companies, because of liabilities and all kinds of other reasons, you find people who would be the kind who would normally drink doing it on the sly or somehow getting through the business day without having to do that. But you mentioned that you were surrounded by this thing from day one. So you were born. Where are you amongst the siblings?
I'm the oldest.
So when you were born, your folks were already engaged in doing what they were doing with regard to alcohol, and
I think that's right. They were kind of hippies growing up here in Austin, and so I was just exposed to it my whole life. I don't ever remember there not being a time.
What did that look like for you when you were a little kid? I mean, you mentioned the traumatic experience of your mother's stroke when you were 8, but what was that like when you were a little kid? How were you processing that?
I remember growing up very much on edge about what was going to happen next. Through Al-Anon and through this program, I recognize all these signs now in retrospect, looking back. But as a child, I remember being in my bed at night and just waiting, hoping that I would hear the sound of my dad's car drive up the driveway, because that meant he made it home safe. And that was literally every other night, But that was a weird thing to be worried about as a elementary school kid,
Well, I used to worry about the same thing. I would sit on the stairs. My folks said, we'll be home by 11. And if they weren't there by 11, man, I started to panic and thought all the worst thoughts. And somewhere along the way, I let go of that. But when you're a little kid, that kind of stuff just terrorizes you.
It does. And it's that feeling of not knowing what's going to happen next. And that feeling, it's a progressive disease. So as it worked its way through my dad, that just got worse and worse and worse and worse. And so what started is kind of worrying about, is my dad going to make it home okay, to, is my dad coming home at all? And then if he comes home, as I grew older, are we going to get in a fist fight? Is he going to clear all the furniture in the living room when he comes in? What state is he going to be in? Is he going to be the mad guy or the happy guy? How drunk is he going to be? All those things start to gnaw on you, know, and make you really unsettled.
Who did you have to turn to whenever those feelings came up? Were you able to discuss it with your mother, or was there, even amongst your siblings, were you ever able to even just process that your dad's behavior with anybody?
No. Huh. No, my mom, when she had a stroke, she couldn't speak after that. And then she had to learn, who we were again, and learn how to talk again, which took years. And then to walk again, which took years. Even, she could never really walk again, or get dressed again, or make her own meal again. And so, and my siblings were younger, and so I just kind of internalized that as maybe how I'd characterize it.
Yeah, like the repressive thoughts.
Yeah, and then it just gets, as I grew up, it just got worse and worse and worse. And the the window dressing, if you will, from the curb of our family, you couldn't hide it anymore, you know?
Yeah.
And at some point there, actually, I know the exact point, it was 2002, and we had an intervention with my dad. And at that point, I had moved out, and my sister was living at home. She was in high school. And we came back and we had an intervention with a professional intervention guy. I was still drinking at the time, and we came back, and this is where I really saw, you know, full scale alcoholism and what somebody can do. Because I remember, you know, my dad was cared about his family. He was a very lovely guy. He's one of the funniest, smartest guys I've ever met, but could be impossible to deal with and horribly scary, but also a lovely human being. So this, you know, I could, those things we learn about in this program, you know, what it says, you know. Now in retrospect, I can recognize those things, but they were hard to reconcile at the time, right?
Yeah.
And then we came back and we had an intervention with him, and he said, basically, screw you all, and I've done everything for you, and it's my way or the highway. And he drove away from there, and we were all in tears, and my mom moved out and my sister moved out, and I had to support them at that time, which I could barely do. But at that time, I remember seeing how strong alcoholism could be, because in that example, sure, it's one thing for me to plead with my dad, but I was a young man at that time. But my sister was very young, and her pleading with my dad, please stop, we love you, we'll do anything in the world, just please. And for him to look at her in the eyes and say, go to hell. I knew this was a very strong disease, because that wasn't the dad that I loved, if that makes sense.
That's a response of a monster.
Right, it's kind of an awful thing. And I think at that moment, or that kind of time frame, it was a little bit like taking a plate, you know, and dropping the plate on the kitchen floor and it just shattering into 1,000 pieces. And that's what it felt like was happening in my family.
Yeah.
Like it was broken beyond repair, and there was no more sweeping it up. This was a real massive problem.
Was the starting of your drinking associated with wanting to kind of numb out or clear away some of those feelings that you had about what was going on in your family of origin, or were you doing it simply for fun? What was the motive behind your drinking?
I think it was a little bit of everything. I think to change the way I feel, for sure, as we get to learn about in this program. It was a coping mechanism, for sure. I also used it for fun and for, you know, I could talk to people, and I could, you know, it did what it does for many alcoholics, which is it can kind of make you feel 10 feet tall and indestructible, and push a lot of those feelings that I had about my family, you know, in the vault deeper. Let's just put those away. I don't want to deal with any of that right now.
Well, and then the feeling comes up that would never happen to me, which is what I find whenever I interview people or talk to people about how the heck could they want to drink or use if they were so abused by it by their parents' behavior. You know, there's that sense of it'll be different with me. I mean, I certainly felt that way. As you were taking your first drinks, or you were getting drunk for the first number of times or over a period of time there early in your drinking career or your drugging career, what kind of thoughts went through your mind about what you were doing with the reality of how you had grown up with your dad's behavior?
You know, it never in the beginning struck me as odd, because the surroundings had been so alcohol induced. So, you know, the feeling that I was doing something wrong by doing that, it was actually kind of the opposite in some really strange way, which was, this is the way the adults around me behave. This must be how you operate. Because I've never seen anyone be sober as an adult in my life. Everyone is effectively a hard drinker or an alcoholic. I mean, I just was not around people that were sober. Like, this idea is totally foreign to me.
Was that by design or coincidence?
I think it was a coincidence in that I never saw anything but that. I think it was by design that my father, as an alcoholic, surrounded himself with alcoholics. And so, I think about it today because I have kids that are 14 and 11. I feel like the perception of Alcoholics Anonymous today, or the idea of getting sober, is so different, even in the last 2 decades, I would say. Mm-hmm. It's so much more commonly accepted, and people are open about their sobriety, by way of example. But back then, I think it still had a lot of stigma to it. And I certainly never met anyone in my family or otherwise who was like, oh, this guy's in recovery. That was a totally foreign concept to me.
So you had to count on what you knew about AA or getting sober from other sources outside of the people you were around. Did any of those sources materialize in your life at any point?
Well, my best friend who got sober, I think he has 23 years. So he's been sober for a while longer than I have. When I watched him do it, and the effects of his life, was the first time a light bulb went off in my mind about there is an alternative. And not only is there an alternative, but wow, that alternative looks much better than what I'm currently doing to myself. You hear it said in the program, it takes what it takes. And it took a while for me to be willing to sit all the way down into, as we say in the program, surrender. We like to fight as alcoholics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Seeing your friend get sober and stay sober and his life improve, was there ever anything in that you thought might be valuable in your life?
Well, I'd say there were 2 things, and you asking me this actually makes it clear, which is really cool because I haven't thought about this. But there were 2 things going on with 2 people that I really admired and loved. One was my best friend, and one was my father. Mm-hmm. My father is increasingly going off the deep end. His life is going to shambles. And on the other hand is my best friend who got sober, and his life is getting insanely better. And so it starts to become obvious, even to a numbskull like me, that, wait a minute, one of these ways is just a miserable plot to the end, which is what it was for my dad. And the other way is, a relief from this. And so, after I went to that first AA meeting, it took a while. I became addicted to prescription drugs, which was a whole other kind of disaster of addiction. And that addiction really lasted for 8 years, so I was 35. And then I'd been exposed to AA. I'd gone to a few meetings in that kind of 8-year period and had a few intervals of sobriety, but never had sat all the way down to do the work.
Did you ever revisit your friends and his sobriety? Did you ever ask him about it? And how did he handle discussions with you about his own sobriety?
He was really good. I would have broken relationships, would be a great example. Where I'd done something that I really regretted, and I had broken off a relationship that I cared deeply about. He was like, well, there's a process in this recovery thing of the 12 steps, which is an amends, but you can't just do an amends. You actually have to do there's 8 steps before that are really important. Yeah. And so it was the planting of those seeds that started to chip away. I think like every alcoholic, it says, in the book, it talks about the idea that we're different, and that, at some point here, I'm gonna quit. It's just not today, but at some point I'm gonna quit. And that perpetual wheel goes on for days and months and quarters and years. Mm-hmm. It gets so much worse and so much worse and so much worse. And I just finally found myself at the point that I knew what the solution was, which was Alcoholics Anonymous. And I had treated it like a buffet, is maybe how I would describe it, which is, I'll take the things that seem appropriate or interesting to me, and I'll leave the rest behind.
Yeah, I think a lot of people do that. I was certainly that way. When I came into the program, I read the steps. I thought, no, I can probably do this myself. It seems all very well laid out, and I'll take it on my own. And I almost went out after a year of not working the program because I was convinced that the program didn't work. You mentioned 8 years of that. How old were you when all that was going on?
I'd say from the years of 20 to 20 to 28 was hardcore drinking and drugging. Married, divorces.
Divorces?
Yeah, divorces. I've been divorced twice, yes.
Okay. I was just curious. I've never heard that before.
Divorces. And so,
Yeah.
those kinds of things, losing my job, the ongoing kind of hamster wheel of addiction, which just gets worse and worse and worse. And, going to graduate school, for example, and this was in that period, and going to graduate school for business school and being a full addict during that whole thing, going through my first divorce, just the insanity of the behavior that I was doing it's like a full-time job being a hardcore addict,
Well, it was insane, but you're still functioning,
Yeah.
Bret. I mean, that to me is one of the things that made it hardest to quit, was because I could still function. And so the insanity was playing itself out, but you were still moving ahead with marriages and social things and business. At what point did your drinking affect those things? Was it that same 8-year period?
I would say after that 8-year period, so the time between I was kind of in the 28 to 35, I graduated from business school. I got a good job. I was terrible at my job. I got fired from my job. I kept using. I moved to Austin, kept using, got a good job, lost that job. And so these pendulums of insane periods where I had swung from overconfident to totally insecure. And I still do that today, but not near the swings we're talking about. But, the example would be graduate from business school, almost kicked out of business school because my grades were on the line. Just graduate from business school at Rice by the skin of my teeth. And then I get the highest paying job of all my classmates. So I'm like, oh, okay, I'm back. And then I go do that job, for 2 years. I'm terrible at it. I'm using. I get fired from the job. Oh, I'm an idiot. I swing back to the other end of the pendulum. Then I'm unemployed, so I'm really using a bunch. And then I land another job that pays really good. And I hold on to that one for a couple of years. Then I lose that one, and the pendulum swings back.
Did you ever come up with any kind of connection between the using and the drug use and being fired and being bad at your job? Or were those things kind of laid aside while you were full steam ahead?
I could sort of make the connection there that I needed to quit, but it was always tomorrow.
Yeah.
It was always tomorrow. And then the monkey became so outrageously strong that those few moments, or those few times where I really tried to stop, I couldn't. And I think, like a lot of alcoholics, we have an amazing amount of self-will. And so self-will can help you do some things, right? Get into the business school, graduate, get the good job, go complete an Ironman, all kinds of things that self-will generates. But as it relates to this disease, it'll just eat your lunch. And the wins versus the losses started to become very disproportionate until they were really kind of all losses.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying my AA Recovery Interviews podcast, check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first printing of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing and meaningful way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, Amazon, or iTunes. While you're there, enhance your program with another audiobook I produced, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's an engaging audiobook that brings these stories to life for AA members who've never seen them. These timeless testimonials were originally cut to make room for newer stories in the third and fourth editions. But their vitally important messages of hope are as meaningful today as when they were first published. Many listeners will hear these stories for the very first time. Listen to a free sample of Lost Stories of the Big Book on Audible, Amazon, or iTunes. It's also available as a Kindle book or in paperback from Amazon if you'd like to read along. You're gonna love it. And we're back. Was there a period of time in there, Bret, where you had to put the addictive behavior aside for a while to enter something that required full functionality? I'm talking about like getting married and having children.
No, I could never put it down. By that point in my life, it had me whipped, and I could maybe decrease my using a little bit in moments of like, a childbirth, for example, or something like that, but I could never put it down. Because I tried to get off the drugs before, and I literally wanted to kill myself. I fell into this super deep depression. I couldn't get off of it. I had to get more.
Which drugs are we talking about?
Adderall was kind of and so at that point, you're literally an insane person. And you've got to have 5 doctors all over town that are writing me different prescriptions, and I can't run out. And that's my full-time job, is I can't run out. I can't run out of money for this, and I can't run out of the drugs. Everything else is secondary to that. My relationship with my wife, whether I show up at work or not, how I make money, all those things were distant seconds to how can I make sure I don't run out. And that is, in my opinion, really the definition of hell. The drugs were the master. And I just couldn't imagine getting away from it.
What role did your drinking play in all of this? Were you still drinking, or was it strictly the drugs?
I'd been to AA enough. This sounds ridiculous now that I'm like in long-term sobriety, but I'd been to AA enough, and my dad's experience had scared me sufficiently to watch what had happened to him that I quit drinking and was just a full-time addict for whatever that was, call it 5 years leading up to when I actually got sober and stayed sober. It's incredible what an addict will tell themselves. I used to tell people I'm sober, I'm not drinking. Meanwhile, I'm taking 30 Adderall a day, acting like some insane person. I haven't slept in 3 days, and, just a complete mess.
Did anybody ever approach you about that, or what kind of feedback were you getting from your environment about your drug use? 30 Adderall a day is hard to ignore.
Yeah, I think the people that were closest to me, my wife, for example, on August 29th, this is my daughter's first birthday. And at that point, I had lost the job. I was working at like the local car dealership as like a finance manager, which was like a joke. That was the only job I could have. I left that job and was trying to find something else. And I recognized that I had to do something about this addiction. So I went to an AA meeting, and the topic of the meeting was willingness and action, that you had to have both those things in order to get sober. And that resonated with me. And so the willingness and the action, I had the willingness, but I did not have the action part down. And the second thing that happened in that meeting was a guy shared his story that he had also quit drinking, then started using Adderall, finally got honest about it, did the 12 steps and got sober and was sober there. And I thought to myself, wow, if this guy could do it, so could I. So I left that meeting and I drove home, and on the way home, I texted myself about willingness and action and this idea that if this guy Nick K could get sober, so could I. So I walk in the front door of my house. My wife says, you seem like you're kind of spun out on these pills. Did you take more than you're supposed to? And I looked at her and I lied and I said, yeah, I haven't taken any more than, I've taken the 2 that I was allotted today. Meanwhile, I'd taken like 12. And she knew I was lying. And she walked out to my truck, opened up the center console of my vehicle, and pulled out a prescription of these pills and walks in the front door and throws at me and says, I'm done with this. I'm done. That's it. And we'd had a lot of I'm done conversations, but this one was different. I could tell in her tone that she was really done.
What was leading up to that?
Oh, the insanity of me not having a job, the insanity of, financial problems, borrowing money from my in-laws, us being broke. We couldn't afford to get our trash taken away. We now have looked back on that and laughed, but I'd like block that out of my memory. But that's a true statement.
So I'm done is a perfectly rational thing to do.
Perfectly right. Like in retrospect, bless her heart, she held on longer than, anybody should have hung on.
And how old were the kids at this point?
I had one daughter, and that was her first birthday that day. And so I do what any alcoholic does that feels like they're pushed into a corner. I plead, and I said, listen, I want to get sober. I just don't know what to do. We don't have money. I can't go to rehab. I don't know what to do. And she said, well, why don't you call the guy who was acting as your sponsor? You told me. And I said, well, right now? And she said, yes, right now. Why don't you call him? So I called this guy who's still my sponsor today. And I said, Lynn, I have this monster problem. I have an 800-pound gorilla on my back. It's called an addiction to this prescription drug, Adderall. I don't know what to do. Julie's going to leave me. He said, don't worry, come to my house tomorrow. We're going to do the 12 steps. We're going to do it right. Are you willing to go to any length? I said, yes. So I told Julie, I said, listen, if you give me 30 days to try to figure this out, I'll do whatever it takes. And I'm going to go try to do this AA thing with Lynn. And she said, listen, I'll give you 30 days, but on the 31st day, if you don't have this licked to my satisfaction, I'm leaving. She said, I don't care what you have to do in the 30 days. You can burn incense, hold hands with guys in meetings, whatever you guys do, go do it. And I won't bother you, but you have 30 days to do this. And so I go to meet Lynn the next morning, and we do a little step work, and we read the beginning of the book, Doctor's Opinion, Bill's Story. And then I go to the hike and bike trail, and I run, and I come home, and I'm going to take a shower. Mind you, at that moment, I am spiritually bankrupt. I have not thought about a higher power. I have no, religious affiliation at that point of any sort. All I'm trying to do is to just maybe stay sober today. And I get in the shower, and I have this burning bush moment. It's just what happened to me. And I'm taking a shower, and I have this feeling like the walls are closing in, and I got no more arrows. I got no more ways to shoot myself out. I have no more bullshit or great ideas or nonsense to tell people that I just got to put down I got to put down the weapons. And at that moment, I hear a voice tell me as clear as day, so long as you're 100% honest, I'll take care of you. And I had this overwhelming sense of relief. Like, oh my gosh, I'm in this burning building of my life that is completely engulfed in flames, and there is one door to get out. And the condition to turn the knob on the door is that I must be 100% honest. And if I do that, the door will open. And it was the most unbelievable sense of hope that there was a way out of this and that I may be able to live. Mm-hmm. At that moment, I had no idea what living a sober life would look like. It was terrifying. Like, how do I interact with people? How do I deal with problems? All the things that humans deal with as sober people were totally foreign to me because the way I dealt with it before was to numb the way I feel. And so about 2 weeks go by, and I meet with my sponsor every day. We do step work. I go to meetings, and I go to the hike and bike trail, and I come home and I run, and I get through the depression part of this kind of come down of getting off the drugs.
Yeah.
And in that period, my sponsor told me, he said, you need to go to this men's retreat. I was like, I'm not going to a men's retreat with some dudes to talk about whatever they talk about. And he said, well, I thought you were willing to go to any length. I said, okay, send me the address. And so I went to this men's retreat.
Was that in Austin, or where was that?
It was just outside of Austin in Bastrop. And so I go there, and there's a speaker who's going to speak that night. And it's at a campfire, and so there's chairs set up in a campfire, and this guy stands up, and he tells the story. And his story is just jaw-droppingly impactful to me. And I'll paraphrase it, but I'll say he was at the end of his rope, and he sat on the end of his bed, and he loaded his 9mm, and he put the gun in his mouth, and he pulled the trigger. And the gun jammed. And he heard a voice. And the voice to him says, you have not tried everything. So he puts the gun down, and he drives to an AA meeting. And he sits through an AA meeting that happened to be a little crazy, and there was some infighting and nonsense. And so, you've been to a lot of AA meetings. I've been to a lot of AA meetings. It very rarely happens.
Yeah.
But it happened to him. And he gets up from the AA meeting, and he's walking across the parking lot at the end, to go get in his truck, drive back home, and finish the job and kill himself. And a guy comes out of the AA meeting, who's now a friend of mine, grabs him by the shoulder, says, listen, I heard you say this was your first meeting. Come to this next meeting with me. That meeting was kind of screwed up that we just sat through. And so he goes to the next meeting, and he's been sober ever since. I'm paraphrasing the story, but it's a very impactful story.
Wow.
So we're sitting around after this incredible speech he gives, and he sits next to me and he says, Bret, so what do you do for work? What's going on with you? Like, how long have you been sober? And I was like, oh, buddy, I've been sober a couple weeks. I don't have a job. I'm trying to figure it out. I think he said something like, figuring out is not part of the steps. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And so
figure out stuff.
We have this great conversation, and you have to remember at that moment in my life, like most alcoholics at that point, everything is screwed. My wife's about to leave me. My family's all my relationships are fractured. My financial situation is in a negative situation. I have no career prospects. Everything is, including my health, like everything that every guy cares about is in shambles. And so he says to me, you ought to think about solar. I've got this window business. You should think about doing that. And so I'm going to tell you this story because it ties back to the promise that was made to me in the shower. And so this is kind of the end of August, and the long and the short of it is, he tells me about, I should look at solar. So I look at solar. I'm like, this is not what I want to do for blah, blah, blah reasons. All the things he said become true. It's a fragmented market, blah, 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 blah. I make the decision I'm going to start a solar company, but I have no money. End of the month comes along. 30 days are up, and my wife is like, you're still sober. I think we can go 31 days here, and then we'll just do it day by day. So now remember, we are broke. I can't afford to get the trash to get picked up from my house. And so on October the 5th, which is whatever that is, like 38 days later, I have a meeting with a guy about starting a solar business, and we meet at this Mexican food restaurant. I tell him why I want to start a solar company. I don't have any money, but I think there's a huge opportunity. And he says, well, I know how to run solar, guys. I know how to design systems and install solar. He goes, I don't even like people, though. And I said, okay, great. Well, why don't we partner and we can do this? And if you would have asked me a week before then my best idea in life to go try to put it back together, I would have told you, well, I'll just go doctor up my resume and go back to some corporate finance job and try to do something I hate doing for money. And so I stumble into this little entrepreneurial thing, and that was whatever it was, 13 years ago and 8 months. And we started this little business at that time, and we've had this unbelievably fun run. And my point of saying that is to say that the promise that was made to me in the shower has come true, which is to say, I think as people getting into recovery and dealing with this addiction is, I hope I can just quit using, And in reality, what we're given in this program is a miracle that is so much bigger than that. So much bigger than that. In terms of a sense of usefulness and purpose and all the things that we get to enjoy as people who walk the walk in this program. And there's been plenty of problems since then. I mean, all kinds of things.
It's amazing how that all worked out for you. I mean, you're sober less than a couple months, and this incredible opportunity works out for you, and everything else is, the sun and the moon. Tell me about any points where you felt like you were not holding up your side of the bargain. The bargain was, you'll get this great gift, but you must be 100% honest. Tell me about the times at which that was threatened or diminished and how you got through that.
Maybe 5 years into it, things were going good. pink cloud of sobriety, oh my gosh, I figure all these things seem to be getting better. This dumpster fire of my life turns into a garden. And so at that moment, 5 years into it, I decided, well, what would be a great idea is if I had an affair. And affairs are secretive things, right? They're not honest things. And so I ended up having an affair. And that did not work out so great.
Now, was this after your first wife had stayed with you for that period of time?
No, my first wife was long since gone after she couldn't deal with the addiction. So she was gone before I got sober. Then I got married. Before I got sober again. And so the mother of my children, Julie, is the one who made the deal with me for 30 days. And that's the one I had an affair on. And so she had told me early on, if you ever do anything like that, I will leave you. We will not discuss it. And there I was doing what it says in this book in terms of selfishness, right? Oh, maybe I'll try this thing here and see if I can get away with that.
So you were shifting your addiction to something else.
Shifting it to something else. And I sat in a meeting in Aspen one time, and this guy walks into the meeting and he says, if alcohol is your problem, you may not be an alcoholic. And what he meant by that, is just by putting the drink and the drugs down is not, that's helpful, that's great. But the problem, as it says on page 62 in this book, is me. My selfishness and my self-centeredness. And that can show up in a lot of different ways. And thank heavens it hasn't shown up in picking up a drink or picking up drugs. But it can show up in different ways. And so it showed up in this affair. Now, here's what I would tell you is the follow-up story to that. I'd have an amends. I had to drive to my in-laws' house and tell them what happened. Obviously, I had an amends with my ex-wife. And while I made a mistake, the program showed me a way to at least make things right the best I could. And I was able to do that the best I could. And if you fast forward to a couple of years after that, my in-laws show up at my house. These are the same people that I had to go to and tell them I had an affair on their daughter after I told them that I would commit to take care of their daughter forever, right? They're pissed, rightfully so. And it wasn't like an amends that I went to where, the person on the other end gives you a hug and says, oh, we forgive you, little buddy, it's all good, They were very upset. I walked myself to the door and cried the entire way home on a 5-hour drive.
So you had expectations that were way higher than they should have been going into that.
Way higher than they should have been going into that,
I'll patch this up with a 9th step amend.
I didn't think I was going to be able to patch it up necessarily, but my point is, in this program, sometimes things, it says in here, we don't do this thing perfectly every day. And there's been times I haven't done it perfectly. And this is an example of that, right? An affair, something horrible like that.
So they show up at your house after a couple years after the amends?
After the amends, fast forward a couple of years, after I've made an amends. And it took some time, and my ex-mother-in-law walks up the steps, and she's from Beaumont. She has this pearl necklace on, and she's got this lovely dress that's all colorful. Think kind of, South Texas, Southern Belle. Mm-hmm. She walks up the steps to my house. This is, we've gotten divorced and we're down the road. She gives me a kiss on one cheek and she gives me a kiss on the other cheek. And she says, honey, I just love you. And I said, I love you too. And she goes, you are the best ex-husband on this planet. And I said, thank you. And she goes, you're not worth a shit as a husband. And we hugged. And I said, given the experience I've put you through, that is a totally accurate statement, But my point of saying the story is sometimes we stumble and the program has a solution to make things right when we mess it up. And we're trying not to mess it up. But there are those occasions when it's happened to me and, the program, people ask me all the time, like, what's your greatest regret? My greatest regret is that I didn't find this program earlier, because I came into this program to quit using and to quit doing drugs, quite frankly. And what I found was this incredible gift of a sense of usefulness and purpose in my life. And I think that's all I was looking for, because I felt less than, greater than, or less than other people. I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. All of this, kind of bobbing on the top of the sea, up and down. And then I get introduced to this idea of a higher power, and a higher power, you either believe or you do not believe that your higher power can solve all your problems. It's pretty straightforward.
And then you have the spiritual awakening, and the directions after that is go out and practice these principles in all your affairs. And it doesn't mean the kind of affair that you had.
That's right.
So did you cut the thing off with the affair immediately, or was that a lingering thing? What was the outcome of that?
I tried to make it work with her. We got divorced and we tried to make it work, and we didn't. And I just had to get honest about all those things, which at the end of the day took a little time for me, How did your program and the fellowship support you, or what was the response of your fellow AAs to your situation, and how did that help or hinder you? The answer is it completely helped. I was blown away by being able to go into meetings and be honest about my situation. I was blown away at the response to my honesty, which was, it's okay. I was blown away at the other people that had also experienced the same thing and came to help or provide some insight. And so the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous have been like a warm embryonic sac, right? For me, it's just like, it just blows me away how much love, compassion, empathy, support, all those things that there are. And this thing is not a magic trick, and that I put in X amount of effort and I get out 3 times X on the other end. You get out what you put in. Yeah, and my feeling is it's like a spiritual bank account. The only problem with it is you never know how much you have, and you also don't know what the next thing is going to cost. And so you're left with needing to just accept it as it is. And what you're saying about how everything kind of folded in to support you and love you through this situation is a beautiful thing. My own experience with having tragic or catastrophic things that might be the reasons why people drank over, those things that occurred, when they happened, my first thought was, I don't want to go to a meeting. I don't want to have to tell people about this. Here I am. And this happened, I was like 16 years sober when it happened. This event, this situation that had me knocked down, the rug pulled out and being hit with a 2x4 while you're going down. And somehow somebody said, it was my sponsor said, if you don't get your ass into meetings and start talking about this, you are not going to survive this. And what he meant was just that. And he was right. No sooner was it that I started to tell people about it, my close, trusted friends. Had it not been for those people, I would have drank, not because I wanted to get drunk, but because I wanted to check out. The analogy that I feel like with sobriety today is we can go through things that are very difficult. And sometimes even not going through things that are super difficult. Let's just call it life, having a bad week, let's just characterize a bad week is like, my life is like a Topo Chico bottle that gets shaken up and it just shakes and shakes and shakes. And then it's got all this pressure, and I somehow have to release the pressure on my life. And the program of Alcoholics Anonymous is like, there's no better pressure releaser that I've ever found than being able to come in and be part of that group, period. And you've been able to do that while being terrifically successful in a business and building it from virtually nothing up to being big and successful.
oftentimes that sort of thing starts to draw people away from their involvement in the program, starts pulling them away from the middle. The disease will find plenty of reasons why you should take that meeting at the time you would normally do lunch.
Yeah.
But, if you're really committed, you're going to say, I can't do the meeting at that time. I've got another commitment that is rock solid and immovable. What kind of things did the accumulation of success and wealth and your place in society, how did those affect your sobriety, both pro and con?
Experiencing what I experienced with my father, which is to say I watched someone who was successful, the smartest guy I've ever met, had the world at his fingertips, and he died in a one-room shack with no running water to this disease. To see that and to feel that every day, because I do think about that almost every day, what this looks like when it goes untreated is a pretty good reminder to me. I could say this today, and I hope I say the same thing tomorrow and for every day I'm on this planet, which is I owe my serenity and all the gifts that I have today to one thing, which is this program. And there are moments, I think, in long-term sobriety that you experience things that you just described, which is maybe I get away from the program a little bit and life gets busy and those things get pushed to the back burner. My higher power has a great way of making that such so that things get pretty sideways pretty quickly, and I have to get back to this program, which to me is like putting on a life jacket. And my commitment is I'm going to put the life jacket on, and I want to buckle it, and I want to cinch it down so that I don't drown. And the crazy thing about this disease, is you get to bob around out there and not drown, right? God willing, I'm not going to die from drinking today or using if I keep this life jacket on. Now, I may be in really rough seas because life is really difficult at the moment, or I may be totally calm and it may be just like picturesque and lovely and easy, but I'm not going to drown. But the weird thing about this disease that makes it so different is it's the only disease that has the little voice in your head that says, you don't need to keep that life jacket on. You know how to swim. You just unbuckle that thing. It's just too tight, And then you see this, it's happened to me where you loosen it and maybe you uncinch one and you're like, okay. And I've been fortunate enough to stay close enough to the program to see what happens when people take the life jacket off, which is you go under. The correlation between my own happiness, let's call it. Mm-hmm. And I feel like I'm trying to solve in my life for happiness. And what I've realized is that equation, there's a lot of things in that equation, right? In all of our lives,
mm-hmm.
Whether it's my relationship with my kids or my partner or this, that, and the other. But there's nothing that impacts that more than the correlation I have with this program and the people in it. And the more I'm involved in this program, doing action, whether it's meeting with sponsees or going to a meeting or being of service or all the things that we can do, I get relief. And I'm now a relief junkie. I want relief,
Would you say you're pretty much tethered to the middle of the program, staying in the middle of the herd most days?
I would most days. I would give my AA, my job performance a B+.
That's pretty good.
It could always be better, but I've been real fortunate. I sponsor a bunch of guys, and I have AA in my life almost every day. Really every day, but maybe a day goes by that I don't meet with somebody.
And you have the opportunity to employ people that you might find have issues.
I think we have 40 people here that are in recovery. Everything from executive level people to warehouse level people. In the conference room next door, it says in 6-foot letters, into action. You know what that means.
Yeah. What's beautiful about that is walking sobriety transmitted to people who may not need it now, but they'll remember it later when they do need it. It's been a gift to me to be able to hear your story and understand you better. We've never even met before this time, but there's just something about a relationship that gets formed with us in AA that when we meet somebody else who has that same relationship, the one thing I always like to thank my guests for is the trust that you've instilled in telling your story to me, maybe talking about things that were difficult, things that were tough, but seeing you stay sober. In fact, I love the idea that if you're sober and successful, you need to go to more meetings. I say that to people, a guy who just hit the big lottery and everything else, or some guy who's risen through the corporate ranks, or some of the professional athletes I've known, and they get so successful, things start to trail off. I said, if you're successful, you need to go to more meetings, because people need to see more than just the people whose asses are falling off. They need to see the guys succeed. They need to know that there's somebody out there who is putting the program of action to work and has succeeded doing it. And so, to me, you seem like one of those model AAs. And I'm not trying to fluff you up. I'm just saying, on the surface, you're probably doing maybe 80% of everything you said today, maybe 90. And to me, that, anything, a B plus in AA is still pretty good, That means I'm still dealing with things inappropriately from time to time.
Well, there's a guy, Chris L., in meetings in Austin. He says it so well, so I give him credit for this. But there's this idea that I show you my scars and you show me yours, and there becomes something healing about that.
Yeah.
And that's what this program is about. To me, one of the greatest gifts is like the idea of vulnerability. We're shown in this program, usually through getting our ass kicked so hard, that we finally get to the point of surrender and finally held down, and we finally send up a white flag and say, okay, I'm willing to try anything. And in that process of like coming back in these steps, this idea of vulnerability becomes a little bit of a superpower, is maybe how I would describe it, which is what you just said is on the money, which is I do not like to go to weddings or big events or things like that where it's just chitter chatter nonsense. How's life? Oh, it's good. Da 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 da. Tell me what's going on. Tell me the worst thing that's going on in your life right now. Let's talk about it. It's like, let's get right to it. And AA has that. If you're in this program and you're doing those things, you automatically know that rule about Fight Club. It's like, let's, tell me what's really going on. Let's talk about it.
And then the God in me talks to the God in you, and then we don't drink.
Yeah.
And we get to know each other better. Thank you for doing this, for sitting down with me, for being candid and open about what's going on in your life. And I honor your sobriety. And I love you as a brother in Alcoholics Anonymous. And again, many thanks for doing this.
Man, thank you. Thank you so much. Like I said, there's no coincidences in the world. And for us to be able to connect as quick as we did, and to get to this point is is no coincidence. This program is filled with miracles. And so getting to talk to you today was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks, brother.
Thank you.
Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. I want to thank my guest, Bret B, for sharing his story. And thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed the interviews in this podcast series, will you do a little service work by spreading the word about this rich and meaningful listening experience? This show is another helping hand of AA we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. AA Recovery Interviews is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all other podcast providers. Or visit our website, aarecoveryinterviews.com, where you can listen to every episode of AA Recovery Interviews. And if you want to contact me directly with any comments or suggestions, simply email Howard at aarecoveryinterviews.com. Please also take a minute to leave a rating and review wherever you get your podcasts. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs, and no one receives financial gain from the show. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.